How can an empire that once dominated continents, negotiated as equals with Egypt and Babylon, and shaped the very foundations of civilization be almost entirely forgotten? The story of the Hittites is one of the greatest mysteries in history, a vanished world whose echoes still shape our lives today, even if you've never heard their name. Imagine a civilization so powerful that they signed the world's first known peace treaty, yet for centuries, not even the dust of their cities could be found. How does an empire disappear, and what did they leave behind for us to discover? Close your eyes and picture the ancient world, pyramids rising from the sand, Babylon's ziggurats stretching to the sky, the thunder of chariots echoing across the plains. But just beyond the pages of most history books, in the heart of Anatolia, another power was rising, the Hittite Empire. While Egypt and Mesopotamia wrote their stories in stone and clay, the Hittites quietly redrew the map of the ancient Near East, forging a legacy that would outlast their own memory. Let's start at the beginning. Around 1650 BCE, a group of Indo-European settlers, the Hittites, established themselves in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Their capital, Hattusa, was carved into the landscape, surrounded by massive walls and hidden gates, a fortress city unlike anything else in the region. If you'd stood on those walls 3,500 years ago, you would have seen a bustling metropolis alive with traders, artisans, and priests, and the distant smoke of iron forges. Yes, iron. The Hittites were among the first people to master ironworking, a secret so valuable it became a weapon all its own. But who were the Hittites, really? Unlike the Egyptians or Babylonians, they didn't build pyramids or towering statues of themselves. Instead, they left behind clay tablets, hundreds of thousands of them. These tablets, written in a language no one could read for millennia, contained everything from royal decrees and legal codes to international treaties and even prayers to their many gods. For centuries, these tablets were buried under the earth, their secrets lost to time. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists finally uncovered Hattusa and the treasure trove of texts that would rewrite our understanding of the ancient world. Suddenly, the Hittites emerged from the shadows, not as a footnote but as a superpower. They had clashed with the mightiest kingdoms of their age, fought Egypt to a standstill at the legendary Battle of Kadesh, and signed a peace treaty so enduring that a replica hangs on the walls of the United Nations today. But let's go deeper. What made the Hittite Empire so unique? For one, their government was surprisingly modern. The king ruled, but he was bound by a council of nobles and priests. Women, including queens like Puduhepa, wielded real political power, signing treaties and running the court. The Hittite legal system was ahead of its time, offering compensation instead of revenge, and protecting the rights of ordinary people. And then there's their religion, a wild, tangled web of gods borrowed from everywhere and everyone. The Hittites were religious magpies, absorbing deities from conquered peoples, mixing them into their own pantheon. Their rituals were elaborate, their festivals legendary. If you were a visitor to Hattusa, you might witness 1,000 priests and priestesses parading through the city, offering sacrifices and singing hymns to gods with names like Tarhunt and Irina. One myth tells of a storm god who battles a dragon. Sound familiar? This story would echo for centuries, shaping myths from Greece to Scandinavia. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the Hittite story is how they interacted with their neighbors. The Hittites weren't just warriors and conquerors, they were diplomats, negotiators, and spies. They sent envoys across the ancient world, forging alliances and sometimes betraying them. In one famous letter, a Hittite king scolds the pharaoh of Egypt for not sending enough gold. Imagine the audacity. And yet, when the two greatest armies of their time faced off at Kadesh, neither side could claim victory. Instead, they chose peace, a radical act in an age of endless war. The Treaty of Kadesh doesn't just mark the end of a conflict. It sets the stage for diplomacy as we know it. Now, you might be wondering, if the Hittites were so influential, why did they disappear? This is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Around 1200 BCE, the ancient world was shaken by a series of catastrophes, earthquakes, invasions, famine, the so-called Bronze Age collapse. Cities burned, kingdoms fell, and the Hittite Empire, already stretched thin by internal strife, simply ceased to exist. Hattusa was abandoned, its walls left to crumble. For nearly 3,000 years, the world forgot the Hittites ever existed. But their legacy didn't vanish. The techniques of ironworking, the art of treaty making, the myths and laws, they all spread, carried by survivors and neighbors alike. Even the Greeks, centuries later, would build their legends on Hittite foundations, often without realizing it. In fact, some scholars now believe that the myths of Troy, and the stories of Homer, may have roots in real Hittite history. Imagine that. The seeds of Western literature sprouting from a forgotten empire. Let's take a closer look at life in Hittite society. Daily life was surprisingly diverse. The Hittites were skilled farmers and traders, their markets filled with goods from across the ancient world. Tin from the east, wool from the highlands, silver and horses from the steppes. They built complex irrigation systems to tame the Anatolian landscape, and their roads linked distant provinces with the heart of the empire. In their homes, families gathered around hearths, children played with clay figurines, and scribes copied texts by lamplight. But this was also a society shaped by war. The Hittites perfected the use of the chariot, a fast, deadly machine that changed the face of battle. Their armies swept across Anatolia and Syria, sometimes crushing cities, sometimes integrating them into the empire. Yet the Hittites were not just conquerors. They had a knack for turning enemies into allies, granting autonomy to local rulers and weaving a patchwork of cultures into their imperial system. One of the most remarkable figures in Hittite history is Queen Puduhepa. Married to the great King Hattusili III, Puduhepa was more than a royal consort. She was a diplomat, a priestess, and a power broker. Her correspondence with the Egyptian court is legendary. She negotiated marriages, settled disputes, and even wrote to Pharaoh Ramses II as an equal. In an age when women's voices were often silenced, Puduhepa's words carried across continents. Hittite law also stands out. Their legal codes were detailed and, by ancient standards, humane. Instead of the brutal, eye for an eye, punishments common elsewhere, Hittite law often favored fines and compensation. There were laws protecting the vulnerable, including orphans and foreigners. The Hittites even recognized the concept of sanctuary. Refugees could flee to certain temples for protection. Sound familiar? These ideas would echo down the centuries. But for all their achievements, the Hittites were still human, riven by rivalries, plagued by plots, and sometimes undone by their own ambitions. The royal succession was rarely smooth. Brothers and cousins schemed against each other, generals turned traitor. In one dramatic episode, King Mu'tali II was forced to move the entire capital hundreds of kilometers south to escape internal enemies and secure his rule. Imagine the logistical nightmare. An entire city on the move. And yet, out of this chaos came a kind of resilience. The Hittite state endured for centuries, adapting to crisis after crisis. When famine struck, they organized relief efforts. When invaders threatened, they rebuilt their armies. Even in defeat, they found ways to survive, sometimes as vassals, sometimes as independent city-states, long after the central empire had fallen. So why did the Hittites vanish from history? Partly, it was bad luck. Their archives were buried, their monuments lost. Their language, written in a script called cuneiform, was forgotten, and for centuries no one could decipher it. When Greek and Roman historians wrote their histories, they skipped the Hittites entirely. The Bible mentions the Hittites as a minor tribe, but these references were so vague that scholars once thought they might be mythical. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the pieces began to fall into place. Archaeologists digging in Turkey uncovered the ruins of Hattusa, and with them, thousands of tablets. Linguists cracked the code, and suddenly, the lost empire spoke again. The world learned that the Hittites had not only existed, they had changed the course of history. Let's not forget the Hittites' technological legacy. Their mastery of iron changed the balance of power. Before the Hittites, weapons and tools were made of bronze, a precious and sometimes rare alloy. Iron was harder, more durable, and, once the process was understood, far more abundant. The spread of iron technology helped topple the old order and usher in a new age. Without the Hittites, the Iron Age as we know it might have looked very different. Their influence can also be seen in the art and architecture of later civilizations. The Hittites built monumental gateways adorned with sphinxes and lions, and their reliefs, carved in stone, depict scenes of gods, kings, and commoners alike. These images would inspire later Anatolian cultures, and even echo through the art of the Greeks and Romans. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Hittites is the idea that history is never as simple as it seems. For centuries, we imagined the ancient world as a clash between Egypt and Mesopotamia, with Greece waiting in the wings. The rediscovery of the Hittites shattered that illusion, revealing a world far more interconnected, complex, and surprising than we ever dreamed. So, why does this matter today? Because the story of the Hittites is the story of how history is written, and how easily it can be erased. Their empire shaped the world, yet for millennia, their memory was lost. How many other forgotten powers lie buried beneath our feet, waiting to be rediscovered? What lessons are still hidden in the sands of time? The Hittites remind us that civilization is fragile, but also that ideas, laws, treaties, technologies, can outlast even the mightiest empires. Their forgotten story is a warning, but also an inspiration. It tells us that history is not a straight line, but a web of connections, ruptures, and rediscoveries. So next time you hear about the ancient world, remember the Hittites, the forgotten empire that changed world history forever. If you enjoyed this journey into the lost corners of our past, don't forget to hit subscribe and join the History Owl community. There are so many more stories waiting to be uncovered, and together, we can make sure that no empire, no matter how forgotten, stays lost forever.